The whistle screams before the sun rises. Darkness still fills the streets, but the city is already awake. Boots hit wet pavement, doors slam, breath turns to mist in the cold air. Men and women move fast, eyes low, lunch pails in hand. No one speaks. There is no time. Inside the factories, the noise never stops. Metal crashes against metal. Steam hisses, belts spin, machines shake the floor like distant thunder. Fingers bleed, backs bend, lungs burn with dust and smoke. One mistake can cost a hand, one slow step can cost a job. In the tenements, children wake to hunger. Thin blankets, shared rooms, the smell of coal and sweat. Some are already working, others will soon. School can wait, survival cannot. This is not a battlefield, but every day feels like a fight. People are exhausted before noon, afraid before nightfall, one illness away from ruin, one missed shift away from eviction. Life moves between work and sleep, and sometimes there is no space for hope in between. And yet the world calls this progress. This is the early 1900s, a century of iron, smoke, and relentless motion, a time when work promised dignity, but often delivered pain. How did ordinary people endure this life, and what did survival truly mean in the modern age? To understand this world, we must look at it not as history, but as lived experience. The early 20th century was a turning point, a moment when humanity stood at the edge of something new and paid a heavy price to get there. The world was changing faster than ever before. Cities were growing upward and outward, factories multiplied, railroads cut across continents, electricity lit the night, new machines promised efficiency, wealth, and a better future. But for millions of workers, this future arrived wrapped in danger and uncertainty. This was the age of mass labor, of long shifts and short lives, of crowded streets and crowded lungs, of people becoming part of machines rather than the other way around. Factories demanded time, not hours, entire lives. 12-hour days were common, 6 days a week, sometimes 7. There were no safety nets, no guaranteed rest, no paid leave. Injury meant dismissal, age meant replacement. Work was not just how people earned money, it was how they were measured. A man's worth was his endurance, a woman's value was her productivity. Children were small hands that could fit into small spaces. Everyone had a role, everyone was expendable. And yet, many believed this was the best era to be alive. Wages, though low, were steady. Jobs were plentiful in the cities. Compared to rural poverty or past centuries of famine and war, industrial life seemed like progress. People left farms and villages chasing opportunity, convinced the city would offer something better. At first, it did. Immigrants arrived by the millions. They crossed oceans and borders with little more than hope and necessity. They filled the factories, the mines, the railroads. Different languages, different customs, the same exhaustion. Cities became living organisms, breathing, expanding, consuming. Neighborhoods formed around industries. Entire lives revolved around the sound of factory whistles and shift changes. This was a world built on movement, on constant production, on the belief that tomorrow would be bigger, faster, richer than today. But that belief hid a fragile truth. The very systems that powered this new age were stretched thin. Wages barely covered rent, housing was overcrowded, sanitation lagged behind growth, air and water were poisoned by progress. Disease spread easily, accidents were routine. Success demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice was always personal. There were no cameras here, no headlines for the everyday suffering, just quiet endurance, quiet fear, quiet loss. When a worker collapsed at his station, the machine did not stop. When a child was injured, another child took their place. When a family lost its provider, neighbors whispered and moved on. This was not cruelty by design.
It was indifference by scale. The modern world had grown too large to see individuals. And still, people kept going. They woke before dawn. They stood in line for work. They trusted that effort would be rewarded, that pain had meaning, that survival today might lead to something better tomorrow. This belief held society together, but it was already under strain. Because the early 1900s were not just about work, they were about vulnerability, about how close collapse always was, how one shock, economic, social, or invisible, could bring everything down. The world felt solid, factories ran, markets moved, cities thrived. But beneath the noise and motion, cracks were forming. And soon, the people who worked hardest would discover how fragile this new world truly was. In the next chapter, we will step deeper into this era, into the structure of this industrial society, the promises it made, and the hidden costs it demanded from those who built it with their bodies and lives. Because to understand survival in the 1900s, we must first understand the system that defined work itself. The system did not collapse all at once. It cracked quietly. A factory slowed production, a mine closed without warning, a railroad laid off hundreds in a single afternoon. For the workers, there was no announcement, no explanation, only absence. The whistle did not sound. The gates remained shut. In neighborhoods built entirely around labor, silence was terrifying. Men stood outside locked doors, hats in hand, waiting for someone to speak. Women stretched meals thinner. Children listened to whispered conversations at night. Rent was still due, food was still needed, but work was no longer guaranteed. Industrial society had taught people to depend on wages. When wages vanished, so did stability. This was the great vulnerability of the modern age. People had traded self-sufficiency for efficiency, community for specialization. In doing so, survival became tied to systems far beyond individual control. When illness spread, workers had no protection. When accidents happened, families had no compensation. When economic downturns hit, entire populations were left exposed. And fear changed behavior. Neighbors became competitors. Immigrants were blamed for shortages. Rumors spread faster than facts. Strikes erupted. So did violence. Workers organized, demanding safer conditions and fair pay. Employers responded with force, blacklists, and private guards. Streets once filled with routine became scenes of confrontation. These conflicts were not just about money. They were about dignity. People were no longer willing to accept pain as the price of progress. They questioned the idea that suffering was necessary, that exhaustion was virtuous, that survival alone was enough. But change came slowly and unevenly. While cities struggled, rural areas felt the shock differently. Farms depended on urban markets. When factories slowed, demand dropped. Crops went unsold. Equipment broke without replacement. Isolation deepened hardship. In some places, nature began to reclaim what industry had abandoned. Rail lines rusted, empty housing decayed, fields returned to weeds. Progress, once unstoppable, now looked temporary. This was not the end of work, but it was the end of innocence. By the middle of the century, the lessons of the early 1900s were impossible to ignore. Governments intervened, labor laws emerged, work hours were limited, safety standards introduced, child labor restricted. The idea that survival should not require destruction slowly took hold. These changes were not gifts, they were won through strikes, through sacrifice, through lives shortened by the very systems they helped reform. The modern worker was born from this struggle, not free from pressure, but no longer completely invisible. And yet, the legacy of that era remains. We still measure time in work hours. We still tie worth to productivity. We still fear falling behind. The rhythm of the factory whistle echoes in alarm clocks, deadlines, and performance metrics. The early 1900s taught humanity how powerful coordinated labor could be and how dangerous it becomes when human limits are ignored. Survival then meant endurance. Survival now means balance. But the question remains, have we truly learned where the line should be drawn, or have we simply rebuilt the same pressures in quieter forms? The people of the early 1900s did not live to become symbols. They lived to get through the day. Their stories are not heroic in the traditional sense, but they are foundational. They remind us that progress is never neutral, that every system extracts a cost, and that survival is always negotiated, never guaranteed. To look back at their lives is not to romanticize hardship, but to recognize it. Because understanding how they worked, endured, and survived